The speaker is Mr. Hoseup Rhee. Could you please, the title of the speech will be True Logos as eikōn of Forms. Mr. Hoseup Rhee, could you start by briefly introduce yourself?
Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Hoseup Rhee, and I'm studying a master's course in Seoul National University. And thanks for giving me an opportunity to share my study with others. And let's begin with my sharing my monitor. Where is it? And I have an announcement. My paper has been sent with email from organizer committee, but after that I have revised the paper a little bit. So I've uploaded the paper in the chat room now. So if you need to read the paper, please download it. And please, just a second, I need to change a preference for sharing my monitor. Where is it?
I was able to download your file successfully. What did everybody could? Okay. Then you can go ahead. I downloaded your file and was able to see it.
I'm changing. Now I can't share my screen, so I'm changing the preference. What? Okay, can you see it? Okay, let's begin. True logos as eikōn of forms. Introduction. In sophist, Plato proposes a division of two kinds of images, namely likenesses and apparitions. According to this division, likenesses are images that resemble its original, but apparitions are images that only appear to resemble its original. Many scholars have discussed how this division relates to the characterization of true first logos, which is also described in this dialogue. One view suggests that the pair of true first logos corresponds with two kinds of images. In other words, true logoi are likenesses and first logoi are apparitions. Some scholars, however, reject this view on some grounds, including that true logos is not an image. In this paper, I argue for the correspondence between the two kinds of images and true first logoi, considering some implications of this view in connection with knowledge of forms. Images in general. In Republic the 10th, Plato looks at various appearances of a bed that change depending on points of view and paintings that represent this appearance. Some general features of images are revealed. Images imitate only the appearances of an object. Plato's explanation involves a certain theory about the metaphysical structure of the individual. An individual consists of constant being and various appearances. However, there is a metaphysical gap between them. How does a thing present diverse appearances while resting on constant being? Or why should those appearances belong to one being? Plato is aware that de facto there are two modes of cognition. One is based on sense, and the other is purely intellectual. Since the latter satisfies qualifications for knowledge, the iure superiority is given to it. For Plato, an object is already a synthesis. However, the fundamental of the synthesis, qualification for knowledge, is not distributed equally, our cognition must ascend. The possibility of reproduction, it is due to the fact that images have material substance separate from its original. As a consequence, we can be acquainted with the object without perceiving or experiencing it directly. Even if the object ceases to exist, the image preserves its information. In this way, the term image refers not to the appearances themselves, but to the thing that represents them with a separate medium. Possibility of falsehood or deception. A painter can make children believe that a painting of a carpenter is a real carpenter by showing the painting at a distance. This kind of deception should meet three requirements. The children perceive the painting at such distance that they cannot notice it is a painting. 2, they already know what a carpenter looks like. 3, the look which the painting represents coincides with the one which the children already know. In these conditions, the children have a first belief that what they see is a real carpenter. However, the problem is that this is not the only type of deception with images. We may be deceived by images even though we are aware that they are images. It can happen when we do not fully know the original and when the image is misrepresenting it. As we are going to argue, the division of images is proposed in order to explain this type of deception. Likeness and apparition. The division of images into likenesses and apparitions must be understood in light of the basic characters discussed above. Namely, as far as both are images that represent the appearances of an object, they are not immune to the effect of points of view. In other words, likenesses may not appear to resemble its original as much as apparitions appear to resemble it. If so, how can we distinguish them? The essence of likenesses is that it resembles its original in reality. Here, the meaning of reality has to be interpreted in relation to the metaphysical structure of the individual. The likeness is the image that turns out to resemble its original when it is discerned not at the level of appearances that vary depending on the viewpoint, but according to a measure that gives unity to such appearances. Such a measure would, for example, be the geometric system that allows us to count and compare size and shape of objects. The system enables us to calculate the absolute size of things regardless of relative distance and location. Likenesses are images that in such an absolute system have the same proportions as the original. On the contrary, the essential character of apparitions may then be that they merely look like the original, that is, acquire their similarity only by the inherent effect of the viewpoint. However, the example of visual refinement provided in Sophist is somewhat confusing. This is because, according to this example, it is assumed that for one to misunderstand the apparition as the likeness, i.e., to believe firstly that the apparition represents an exact appearance, the likeness and the apparition convey the same appearance of its original. But if so, what's wrong with that? This appearance could be ascribed to the original without any trouble. The example assumes, as we have seen in the case of Republic X, that the appearance of likenesses is well known in advance and consequently that of its original as well. As we saw, it is not the only case of deception related with images, and Plato is surely aware of this. In the introductory dialogue in Critias, Plato distinguishes two kinds of imitations with regard to the type of object imitated and describes different evaluative responses to each kind. On one hand, in the case of imitation of familiar and ordinary objects, people make a strict evaluation of such imitation since they are already well aware of the object. On the other hand, when it comes to imitation of unfamiliar and extraordinary objects, such as the heavens and things divine, since they have no precise knowledge of such things, they are content to accept an art of suggestion and illusion for such things, as vague and deceptive as this art is. Funimasaki, the case Critias is talking about seems odd How can we judge that it is similar to the original, even though we are not familiar with the original? But that really happens because we tend to make judgment based on something else rather than on intellectual reasoning. In other words, what we use as the basis for such judgment is emotional effects, such as pleasure and pain, that are at most mere byproducts of cognitive information of the object, if not irrelevant at all. Such effects are inherent only in the realm of appearance and perspective, so they cannot exist in the purely intellectual cognition. This is exactly what Plato has in mind when criticizing apparition makers of ignoring the real and considering only the looking beautiful. Lawfully speaking, this contrast might be close to the distinction between what to reproduce and how to reproduce. Surely, this discrimination is just a conceptual one, but based on this, we can conceive an idea of purely aesthetic elements that are not reduced to cognitive information. The beauty created by such elements arouses our admiration and pleasure, but at the same time, it causes an arrogation that projects subjective emotion to the object while paralyzing the intellect. Our explication of deception with images provides answers to some interpretive problems. To sum up, firstly, there is the division according to the object imitated. M1, familiar and ordinary objects, and M2, M is the M of mimesis, M2, unfamiliar and extraordinary objects. Secondly, there is the division in regard with the type of confusion. C1, confusion between the image and the original, and C2, confusion between likenesses and apparitions. C1 occurs under the condition that one does not know that it is an image, and C2 occurs when she knows. What should be noted here is that the distinction between likenesses and apparitions is also a conceptual one. A single image may contain several parts that resemble or do not resemble the original. If we pay attention to the similar ones, we would call the image a likeness, but if to the dissimilar ones, an apparition. In case of the former, deception of M1 and C1 mainly occurs. This is the case as in the example in Republic the 10th. In this respect, the possibility that likenesses might be involved in falsehood about which some interpreters have been doubtful is sufficiently justified. In the latter case, mainly M2 and C2 happen, but it does not exclude C1. For instance, if a child in ancient Greece who is fond of the Greek myth looks at an incorrectly reproduced statue of a god from a distance, he would mistake it for a real god. In other words, it is important whether one is aware that the image is an image or not. Logos. What is logos? In Sophist, Plato explains the synthetic structure of logos. Logos is a combination of a name and a verb, and by turning a logos, we do not only refer to the object that the name denotes, but say something about it. Here, two aspects of logos can be found. Logos may refer to spoken statements, but it also signifies activities of statement making. When one says or thinks of the statement, Theaetetus works, this statement represents a certain activity of statement making. Although this activity is represented and completed in the linguistic form, it is not by itself a verbal entity. We might say that the statement is an outcome of the activity and an instrument of it, in that one can make others think as one thought with the statement, although it's not always successful. For Plato, these activities can be expressed in the notion of movements of the soul. In Cratylus 420b to c, Socrates gives etymological accounts for a series of terms designating cognitive or intentional activities of a soul. The word doxa implies the pursuit the soul engages in when it hunts for the knowledge of how things are, along with oiesis that seems to express the fact that thinking is the motion of the soul towards everything, towards how each of the things that are really is. In the same manner, the visitor from Elea describes ignorance as the deviation of a soul that is trying for the truth but wanders away from understanding because of this proportion between the soul and the object. In a sense, logos Logos is an image of a soul, as an interesting passage of Republic suggests. Firsthood in words is a kind of imitation of this affection in the soul, an image of it that comes into being after it and is not a pure falsehood. On the other hand, when Plato defines thinking as internal speech and describes akin to this the concepts of judgment and impression, it amounts that logos is declared as a form regulating intellect. Thinking is expressed as a completed form in logos. The examination about the syntactic structure of logos should be understood not as a pure linguistic observation, but as an argument about the normative structure of intellectual understanding. In short, spoken or written statements are physical representations of certain movements of a soul, and as a consequence, we can convey to others our thinking, sentiment, and information with them. Although this can be represented in the linguistic form, they are not by themselves a verbal entity. Therefore, when we discuss the notion of logos, it ought to be understood not only as a statement itself, but also as the movement of the soul, which is represented or embodied in the statement. Similarly, the connection between logos and reality must be considered insofar as it passes through human recognition. Logos and image. What makes the analogy between logos and image possible? The simplest answer is that we can get information about the original through it. However, the fundamental reason must be given through the metaphysical view about the individual as seen above. Logos is an image that reproduces the various appearances of an object. However, in the case of a visual image, it seems quite natural that the appearance it represents belongs to the object. On the other hand, in the case of logos, for example, in what sense does a statement about Theaetetus reproduce an appearance of him? What does the logos represent, and for what reasons does it have to be regarded as the appearance of the object? To apply the analogy, we reconsider the case of visual image. First, a visual image such as a painting created by containing the appearance in a separate medium or by reproducing it with another material. Then, what if we consider the cognitive process or activity that kind of medium? When it comes to mental image or visual image, as we call them today, our sense or mind is counted as the medium that contains the appearances and that provides material for making images. At Philebus 39 to 40, Plato is using the term in this way, mentioning the mental image generated from memory and expectation. Likewise, the visual theory in Theaetetus suggests that perception is not one-way reception, but a product of interaction between things and sense organs. Therefore, perception itself can be considered this imaging, making images of being. Here, Plato's explanation of sensory experience supposes cooperation between object and sense organs. Perception in itself is a movement. With that said, it is possible that logos, or more precisely, the movement of intelligence represented through logos, is explained in the same way. There are passages in which Plato seems to argue that perception itself informs something conceptual, such is the case with the finger argument in Republic 7. Here, Socrates says that sight doesn't suggest to it that a finger is at the same time the opposite of a finger. Besides, as Nihamas clearly proves, the errors made by Socrates' interlocutors in the early dialogues are not a confusion between a particular and a universal, remaining at his post and not retreating, referred to as one of courage in Laches, for instance, is obviously a universal, not a particular. Socrates clearly refutes as well that there are exemplifications of that do not show courage. As Nihamas clarifies, what matters is singularity and uniqueness, not universality and abstractness. The form of courage is the only one that gives a single explanation to all instances of courage. Forms can be universals since it can be repeated. It can be repeated, but it is not necessary for all universals to be forms. What Socrates demands is rather, as Kant does, close to the distinction between the sensible, the totality of phenomena, including our recognition of them, and the intelligible, the realm of idea. Of course, For Plato, this was not clear from the beginning. Presumably, in Theaetetus, Plato tried to examine precisely the domain of intellectual concept and its use. Here, the sensation that Kant would call the matter of the phenomenon is exactly distinguished from the concept that Kant would call the form of it. Thus, logos about the sensual object should be understood in itself as a synthesis, but we cannot find this kind of explanation in Plato. However, Plato's awareness of the difference between the two recognitions can be drawn from that their explications are different. While perception is elucidated in light of physical mechanism and hence no active human intervention is required, conception rather in terms of tools or techniques. So the Plato suggests that logos is the intrinsic form of intellectual recognition and its basis is naturally given to reality. His attempt to clarify the nature of language from the point of view of techne and to justify its symmetry to reality is best witnessed in Cratylus. Briefly, with Abraham's assistance, Plato's strategy is to define language as an instrument that has a certain function. And since functional things or processes presuppose their properties do not presuppose their functions. Language can be considered capable of representing faithfully the nature of things, even though it has been through human recognition. In a word, technique is considered by Plato being between nature and making grounded by nature. And logos represent the natural appearance of things as a result of such technique. Although logos are products of intelligence, they are natural representations of reality in that it is a natural form of intellectual recognition and a technical product of the nature of reality. However, for the reason that logos is a production, it is also possible to misrepresent reality by adding or fabricating things that do not exist in the nature of reality. First statements are, in the sense, apparition of reality. To summarize, the signification of logos and the decision of truth are made in the correspondence with the reality. The basis for this is not the ontological isomorphism of the proposition and the state of affairs, but the metaphysical structure, reality appearance of the object, and the fact that logos is the technical form of recognizing and reproducing the appearance of an object. Logos and forms. If so, in relation with the nature of things, in what sense is logos its appearance? In case of the sensible, the cognitive faculty that correlate with sensory appearance is sense. What about logos about them? Here, the last aporia of Theaetetus comes into play. Logos about Theaetetus represent him only in terms of commons with other entities. If being of him exists, whatever it is not grasped through relation with others, but rather precedes them. Here, the ending of Theaetetus faces a crossroad. It turns back to perception for the sensible, but for forms, it opens the way to ascend to another faculty. Representation of logos is always realized by the commons, i.e., they are matter of logos. In this respect, what logos represent can be an appearance of forms imaged in the sensible. As the Rhee correctly point out, logos in Plato is often not strictly bound by its synthetic structure, but can be used on the onomatopoeian level, regarded as a long name that is combined with names. It is because logos is not by itself a linguistic entity, but a representation of recognition and something recognized. For example, the statement Socrates is wise is a statement about Socrates, but at the same time, it is a statement that represents both an image of Socrates and an image of wisdom, as far as Socrates participates in the wisdom. We could call such an image Socrates' wisdom, and its structure is not very different from that of logos. However, it is certain that all statements in the form of SP represent an image of forms. The paradigm case for this concept of logos substance properties statements. Individual species and species kind of statements could be included here without difficulty. But what about statement of identity? Furthermore, types of predicates must be distinguished. Greek philosophy after Plato put tremendous effort to classifying types and functions of predicates. There was included logic. From these, it is inferred that through first statements, two types of confusion can occur. Accordingly, C1, take place when forms are confused with logos or representation of form. C2, when one accepts the ontological assumption of forms and therefore knows that logos are just images of forms, but one should believe firstly that a certain logos represents appearances of forms. Lacan says the courage is remaining at his post and not retreating. This statement derives from the image of the courage, which can be expressed like, for example, remaining at his post and not retreating, courage, which is already a kind of logos. Lacan's belief that this is the form of courage falls under C1. On the other hand, after Lacan has realized through Socrates' reputation that it does not deserve the form of courage, he can suppose that it's of it. Okay, so our so briefly, briefly here, the role of logos can be found. First, logos fixes an entity to determine the truth of the logos through their name, whatever the speakers have in mind with the name. Even if they are different, the fact that they use the same name can lead to a competition to determine who the owner of the name is. The power of the name is found where even those who tell a lie must speak a lie through the name. Logos opens the common space where we can verify our judgment and purify our soul. Next, logos reproduce the appearance of forms. The being of the form synthesized is logos. The appearance of the form represented by logos, so to speak, is an object aspect viewed from other forms. However, the appearance is different from one in sensibles. It is also various and limited, but the being of the form is perfectly preserved in it because the logos is a priori true. In this respect, not only do forms appear many in the sensible world, but it's also actually many in the intelligible one. The form, as predicted in Parmenides, is truly one in many. However, the recognition of the form as one requires a faculty that exceeds logos. This ability will be called intuition throughout traditional metaphysics and reason in critical philosophy. For Plato, perhaps it is best to call it divine intelligence, but for human intelligence, logos is given. We can access the various appearances of forms through logos, and based on them, we can try to discriminate likenesses from apparitions. For that reason, if Sophia is divine, then Philosophia is human. Thank you for listening.